next speaker. Our next speaker is Jodi DeJong-Hughes, and Jodi, as you guys know, and of course saw all day yesterday, has been a regional educator with the University of Minnesota Extension for over 25 years. She works in tillage systems, soil compaction, improving soil health, and she's going to be speaking to us today about using iron to alleviate soil compaction, which is a very different approach from what we just heard about. But you can't have a compaction conference without talking about iron. And so thank you for presenting to us here, Jodi, and take it away.
Okay, so you can see the main screen, right?
I can see you, yes.
All right, okay. So yeah, we're going to talk about alleviating with iron. We definitely wanted Shannon to talk about that cover crops is the natural way, the more of the long-term way to help take care of a compaction and help prevent compaction at a later date too. So soil aggregation is very, very important. Those little aggregates in there act like columns in the soil, and they help hold up the weight of equipment. And the more tillage you do, the more you destroy them. So here's an aggregated versus a non-aggregated soil. This one on the left is, for full disclosure, is under a grass system. So this is not a farmed crop system here. But it shows you kind of the ideal, which you will never get with just cropping. So you can see here you have a lot of aggregates. These aggregates, again, hold up the weight of equipment. You can see that the roots can get through this aggregation very easily. Water, if you got a pounding rain, we get into this soil very quickly. You have a lot of large pore spaces to get the water down. And you also have a lot of small pore spaces that will hold on to a lot of that water for July and August when it gets hot, and we need that moisture. And also with oxygen. So your legumes, your root systems, they need oxygen down deeper into the soil. The soil here in the middle is one that's been tilled a lot, and it's very low in structure. You can see it's pretty just individual particles. I have a pan here that's at about 3 inches. So that would be their field cultivator. And a lot of times field cultivators are taken into the spring and they think, well, I'm not going that deep. So I should, they don't worry about soil moisture the same way. But if you have smooth metal and you have clay in your soil, you can smear the soil. Now, it may not last that long, but if you don't get a timely rain, this is going to inhibit root growth. Then down here again, about 8 or 9 inches, we have another pan, and that would be his chisel plow. He deep chisels, and it shows up too. Now, these aren't real tough ones, but it can really inhibit the soil. You can see that the water won't get into the soil quite as quickly. Oxygen, you can see that the roots here are mainly up in the top 3 inches. Again, not where we want it with corn. It doesn't hold a corn plant up very well when you only have roots in the top 3. We also get different erosion rates from these two soils. Even if this one wasn't covered, it's just with residues and things like that. It's harder to move soil when it's in an aggregate. It's just physically heavier. You need more wind, you need more water to be able to move that, more energy. So keep in mind aggregation. And tillage takes out aggregation, it just physically breaks it apart. So we're looking at a different equipment and how it works in these soils. We want to preserve as much aggregation as we can. So zone tillage is a very aggressive tillage operation. It helps break up compaction all the way down to 20 inches is what we usually run these at. And it's also called subsoiling. So you hear me say zone tillage, subsoiling at the same time. Here on the left, we have a straight shank. Here on the right, we have more of a parabolic shank, and they do different things in the soil. The benefits of using a zone tiller to break up compaction is when you're not tilling the whole field. You're going in at either 30 inches or 22 inches, whatever your row spacing is, and it can pop through these hard pans. It maintains the surface residue like this photo on top. It just goes through and just goes through soil. Now, ideally, you have the right soil moisture. It goes through, and the way that they sell this is that it goes through soil, lifts it up, and settles it down like a stack of pancakes. I will tell you, you need the exact soil moisture conditions to make that happen. And that won't be consistent across your field. It temporarily does increase water infiltration into this area, but it also puts a lot of air in that area. It is more proven in the southern and coastal states of the US, and the main reason why is because they're old soils. And in the Midwest, we're talking more about glaciated soils, soils that have had a glacier and that they're younger soils. And to me, younger soils are kind of like teenagers. They got a lot of energy, a lot of resiliency, and I'm more of like the southern soils that I need a little more work. Zone till concerns. So if you have all that air in that little zone and then you're going to plant right back on top of it, is there too much? Are you going to have bad seed to soil contact and root to soil contact? It takes huge horsepower, especially on the straight shanks, anywhere from 30 to 50. I've even heard one guy was up to 70. Depends how dry the soil is, depends if you're going uphill, that type of thing. So it takes a lot of energy to pull one of these. And that's why you don't see them more than usually 6 shanks on a machine. And since you're destroying the structure down further, deeper into the soil, will you get more compaction deeper into the soil because you don't have that natural aggregation to hold up equipment from then on. And there is some differences in machinery. The concerns are, again, the drag, the fuel costs. Another big one, especially anywhere you have a glacial moraine or you have, where a glacier has stopped and just dumped a load of rocks, you'll bring up rocks. It is really good at helping to bring back up rocks. And also be very wary of buried utility lines. We have a lot of horror stories in Minnesota where hit electrical lines, hit fiber optics, even hit tile lines because of erosion over the years. They're not as deep as you think they are. And it's an expensive process. So if you go below 18 inches in the US, you need to call 811 and have those fields flagged. Even if you think you know where all the utilities are, we've missed them before. If you have a clay soil, remember, anytime you have flat metal, you can smear the soil. So will you smear this when you're in a clay soil? And are you even getting a return? Are you getting enough of a yield response to pay for the actual pulling of the zone tiller? So we did this study in El Rosa, Minnesota, which is kind of central Minnesota. It was on a clay loam and had good organic matter. It was ridge till. And the reason why we did ridge till is because we zone tilled right where he was going to plant. He ridge tilled over it. And that way we never drove on it again. So we weren't recompacting it with equipment. And we did this in 2 parts of the field. So in early 2000s, people said, this is the poor man's tile drainage. Instead of putting in this expensive tile, just pop through those bad areas and it will, help with water infiltration, be a lot better. So we used this field here. This was done with a Virus, so it's showing the elevation changes, which by the way, are not that much. There was just a little bitty hill here. And so we call this our dry, upland area. And we took our samples here and then the wet depressional area. We stayed out of this transitional area. We went across the field 8 different times and compared it to what he usually does without the zone tiller. This is kind of what it looked like if we did this, when we did this in drier soils. So here's one that is not shanked. So you don't see any deep ripping into here. This one here on the right has the shank and you can see where it went down through the soil. Again, can you see where these pockets of air can be and may cause some problems? Went out there with a penetrometer. And okay, so the ones that you'll see here, this is going down into the soil. The blue is in the wet area, was not zone tilled. So it had the highest PSI, so the most resistance. And we did this right in the middle of the row. And it was so easy to find where we zone tilled. You just go whoop, right down into the soil. And then the pink one here is not zone tilled in the dry area. So both the not zone tilled had a higher pressure. And then when you went into the zone tilled areas, the zone tilled wet was yellow in the low-lying depressional area. And then in the dry area, it had the least amount. So it works better in a drier soil, which makes sense. The thing is though, we couldn't find these the next year. And remember, he's controlled traffic. He's in a ridge till system. He will not drive back on these. So it recompacted or reconsolidated in a year. In the wet areas where we ran the shank, we dug a pit and you could peel it off. It was, okay, so this is the zone tillers going into the soil and it's heading this direction. Okay, so that big arm of it is smearing the soil as it's going through. And you can see it's not setting it up like a stack of pancakes. It's smearing it like butter. And this one over here, you can see too, if you have any clay in the system, you can smear it. And we had some horror stories of how this would just fill up with water and you're planting right back on top of it. And yeah, we've had some massive failures with this as well. So you gotta make sure it's dry enough when you're doing this and dry all the way down to the end of that zone tiller. What did we find out for yield? Well, corn that year, now this was in the wetter depressional area. There was no difference between zone tilled and not zone tilled. In the drier field conditions, no difference between zone tilled and not zone tilled. The only thing that really showed up is if you were in a dry part of the field or a wet part of the field. So it did not help us this year. And when we looked at soybeans the next year, again, we didn't have the best growing conditions. The dry area was about 33 bushel and the wet field conditions was a lot lower, about half. Again, there was no significant difference between the tilled and not tilled. The only difference was whether you were in a dry part or a wet part. So this farmer, instead of using zone tillage as a poor man's tile drainage, is actually took this data to the bank and said, I need tile drainage. And so that's what he did. So again, the penetrometer readings did show a difference from zone tilling, but it didn't last very long. And poor drainage had a much bigger effect on this soil than the tillage. And we're finding that out with a lot of tillage systems, is that tillage is just not as important as we thought it was. There's a lot of zone tilling research. I'm going to go through it kind of quickly because they really do show about the same thing. In Iowa, they subsoiled to 2 feet, and they found that the first year it decreased corn yields almost 10 bushel an acre. And then the second year it decreased them 6.4. Ward Voorhees, who's in Minnesota, he was looking at it and subsoiled to 16 inches. First year, there was no effect on corn or beans. So it's extra time and money and equipment to go through this soil. And the second year, it decreased them by 11 bushel. Iowa did a really neat study with the Soybean Association, and they looked at many, many fields. They just signed up a ton of farmers and said just a yes or no, replicated 4 times across your field. We want to know if zone till's doing anything. I don't have the 05, 06 numbers, but they were almost as high as the 04. So quite a few different ones. They all used a 16-inch, went 16 inches with a straight shank from a John Deere. This is what they found out. In 2003, they got just above a 2 bushel increase in those 30 fields average. Okay. So there was quite a few people who had negative numbers and quite a few that may have gone a little higher. And then in 2004, it was just over 1 bushel. 2005, it was under a bushel. And then 2006, maybe 2 bushels. Well, let's say your corn is $3 a bushel. At the most, you maybe got a $6 return. Well, how much is it to run that deep zone tiller? It's a lot more than $6. So what they decided was there's not enough yield to pay for this, and they ended the study. They also had a lot of complaints from farmers saying, I don't want to pick rocks. I had to pay for somebody to pick rocks. Those rock surface are now causing damage to my equipment. And I'm trying ground rolling to push those rocks back down, which is another expense. So they said, well, maybe we'll try precision zone till. So if we know we have compaction in a certain area, maybe we'll zone till those areas. And they discontinued this. Like I said, they had too many complaints from farmers. A Wisconsin study with Dick Wilkowski, what he did is he wanted to look at the 2 different kinds of equipment. So the straight shank, and then they had the parabolic V ripper. So it has a very big wing in the front and kind of makes it does a lot more tillage in the soil. And you can kind of see, and I'm not an engineer either, but I do love how the mechanics of how equipment moves through the soil. And you can see here with the straight shank and a very small wing here that you're not going to push the soil up very much as you go through the soil. Aaron Day will also tell you you're also putting a lot of pressure on right underneath the shank onto the soil. As it's going through, it's actually compacting right below. That's how you create plow pans. So this one does more slicing through the soil. This one here, as the soil is as the shank is going through the soil, is kind of turning it and churning it. And you can actually get subsoil moved to the top. And we want to avoid that, definitely. We don't want that tan subsoil to get up on top of your nice black soil. This was done in a clay loam soil over in Wisconsin. And they looked at 4 years. And so in the first year, their soybean yields were better with the straight shank versus the V ripper, a lot better. Now, they didn't compare this to regular tillage, not even looking at doing this deep tillage. I would have loved to see them compare this to chisel plow, strip till, no till, to see if there was any advantage to using these at all. But between the two pieces of equipment, we go to 1999, and yeah, they were about the same for soybean yield. For corn yield here, we found out that the straight shank did a lot better here, 225 bushel versus almost about 190 bushel. And in 2000, again, the straight shank did better. So this is mainly a study to show that if you're going to use something deep in the soil, you don't need to be aggressive with it. It can just kind of pop through, slice through the soil. Anthony Bly from South Dakota State University looked at different tillage studies in the Midwest. And he was looking at, okay, now they're doing deep subsoiling, but did they even have a compacted layer? And out of the studies that either said they did or didn't, he looked at the results of what they found out for yield. Now, this one up here is corn. And did they do deep tillage? No, or yes. Did they have a restrictive layer when they did this deep tillage? No. And you can see here, whether they did zone tillage or not, they did not get any increase in yield. And this was at 42 field locations in the Midwest of the US. When they did have a restrictive layer, they did get about a 16% yield increase if they popped through that restrictive layer. So it's showing with corn, if you don't have compaction, a plow pan, this is not for wheel traffic, this is for plow pans, a horizontal pan. It didn't help. Again, for beans, here we're looking at no restrictive layer, no benefit to subsoiling, 64 different field sites. Here we're looking at, okay, yeah, they did have a restrictive layer. And again, it helped increase their yields about 16%. So you make sure you have this restrictive layer before you go out there and put the money into this. Wheat, same thing. If there was no restrictive layer, no benefit to subsoiling. If there was a restrictive layer, then yes, go in there, pop it out. And Aaron talked about, a global lit review, looking across the world, how effective is subsoiling? And, if you missed his presentation, it will be recorded and it will be put on that website that you guys have access to. And go watch it, because the way he explains this is tremendous, and I cannot give it justice. But basically, you're not getting much of a response. And the response can be negative, very negative. And some of it can be quite good. But you got to know at what situation it's going to work for you. So the effects of subsoiling, what we found is that there's very few positive responses. And when they did have a positive response, it was variable. It didn't do it every year, and it was relatively small. In Ohio, where they did not have the glacial till soils, what they found was that, oh yeah, it did help. But within a few years, it was not helpful to them at all. And that's what we're finding across the US. Now, like I said, in southern states, it it can be helpful, but they're going to have to do it every year because every year their soils consolidate back on them. And if I had enough time, Aaron also talked about the types of clays we have. So if you have a smectitic clay, a 2-to-1 clay that shrinks and swells, then that's doing tillage for you, this deep tillage. So why aren't we seeing a response to subsoiling? Well, okay, it may be unfavorable conditions when you're in there. Do you know if your soil is wet at 20 inches? It's really difficult to know. I mean, it's hard enough to find a 2-inch corn seed, when you're trying to make sure you're planting at the right depth, let alone how deep are you pulling this subsoiler through the soil. It needs to be dry all the way down. If it's pulling really, really hard, then you probably have a fairly dry soil. Wheel traffic, if you drive back on this. So when you're going through here, you have aggregated soils, and this is tillage, and it breaks them apart more, making you more susceptible to compaction the next time you drive on the soil. So you want to try controlled traffic with this. Don't drive on the areas that you subsoiled. And maybe the climate was no longer limiting. So do I have time for ruts? What am I at?
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Okay, did you rut your field? Okay, we found out farmers say, well, I think I've seen this for about 3 years. I see, and so we went to 7 fields that were rutted, and we flagged off ruts versus not ruts. And we went in there to look at what are we doing? What we found out was that there was a height difference in the corn, and there was a growth stage difference. It was better in the no ruts, okay? What we found out, it never touched population though. Same there. Moisture didn't matter, but yield, it did. It did hit the yield about 17% lower if you were in ruts, and it was very consistent across these 7 sites. Next, and also here's what the ears look like from those sites. So these rutted ones had poorer poorer pollination, did not fill to the tip, smaller ears, and even these little zipper ears, we call them. And here's the non-rutted, looking pretty uniform compared to the not rutted. When we looked at the soybean data, I was like, oh, soybeans, they can get through this. No, they couldn't actually. They were taller where we didn't have the compaction. They were ahead in vegetative and reproductive growth stages. That means more pods and more nodes out there. And their yield was about 16% better. This was a very low year. We had a drought that year. So how do you use the subsoiler? Remember, aggregation, this structure is your #1 defense against soil compaction. Tillage breaks it apart, moves you over to this area. The more tillage you do, the more you're going to end up over there. So we want to minimize that. If you're going to use a subsoiler, use it once and replant right back on where you used it. Make sure you have a compacted area out there. You can go out with a soil probe, a tile flag, and find it. Or you can go out with a shovel or a backhoe. But I wouldn't recommend a 9-foot, 3-meter pit. 1 meter, a couple feet, that's all you need. Set the shank 1 to 2 inches below. If you have a 6-inch problem, you don't need a 20-inch shank in there. Okay, so just shallow it up and work the soil when it's dry. Rip only where you need it, like in the precision tillage areas, and use the most non-evasive shank, because if you use like that the V-ripper or anything with a parabolic shank, you're going to start bringing up the topsoil, and we don't want that. Don't drive on it again, and use controlled traffic practices. And does anybody have any questions? Was that fast enough? Sorry.
There are a couple questions. I'm going to leave you to chat, post them in the chat, if that's okay. Thank you very much for that, because again, I think that this is an important thing to consider, that there are iron alternatives, but there are a lot of things, extra considerations sometimes that we have to bring in when we're thinking about using iron to fix the problem that was created by iron in the first place. So yeah. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, one more thing. So I would say that I would go in, if you have compaction, go in there and rip it up, but then start using the practices that Shannon was talking about, getting the cover crops and looking at the long-term effects of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. They really do go hand in hand that way, and you can't just rely on that one practice. Thank you very much, Jodi. I see Adam is up. Hi, Adam.